Hello and welcome to Wilson's World Afcon Daily episode 23, in which we'll be previewing the final between the hosts, Morocco and Senegal. They're the two favourites for the tournament. They're the two highest ranked sides. I'm not entirely convinced they're the two best sides, but I think you've certainly got the best side in North Africa against the best side from West Africa. And that, in truth, fits the general model of what's been an extraordinarily predictable tournament. I can't remember another tournament quite like this, where the higher ranked side has won pretty much every game. The last 8, the quarterfinals, they were the highest ranked 8 teams going into the draw. So if you're picking the best 8 teams from Africa, you probably would include Ghana. You might put Cape Verde somewhere near. But these are the 8 best teams. And I guess from an organisational point of view, that's exactly what you want. You want a whole load of games and you end up with the best 2 in the final. It does mean it has lacked some of the drama, some of the intrigue of other tournaments. And I think part of the issue is the structure. I think 24 teams is a bad number in the same way 48 teams will be bad for the World Cup. We've seen this at the Euros as well. But having best third place teams go through, it can create drama on that final day. But what it does is reduces jeopardy. I think 16 teams for Confederational Tournament, 4 groups of 4, or 32 teams for World Cup, 8 groups of 4, with the top 2 going through, it means that there's something riding on pretty much every game. And I think they've compounded that problem, and it'll be the same at the World Cup, with using head-to-head rather than goal difference to separate teams who finish level on points. What that means is that often, for instance, in the case of Nigeria, because they won their first 2 games, they knew they were going to top the group. Whatever they did in their third game, as it turned out, they won it. But they had no need to win it, and they did change their team a lot. Egypt, the same, changed their team a lot and drew that final game. And that damages sporting integrity. And it also, just in terms of you want people to watch, you want that something riding on it. I also think that head-to-head, it places too much on one game. The whole point of having a group stage is that teams get 3 games and they're judged over those 3 games. I don't know why you would privilege one of those games over the other 2. It seems illogical. It seems against sporting integrity. Maybe you get a bad refereeing decision. Maybe you have injuries in that game. Maybe you have 20 shots to 1 but lose it 1-0. Well, the idea of a group is it evens that out. Whereas this says, well, okay, that game we're suddenly going to say that's more important than the other 2. If your argument is you don't want who goes through or placings in the group to be determined by how many goals you score against the whipping boy, against the minnow, well, that tells me your tournament's too big. You shouldn't have teams that bad that they risk it losing 6-0 or 8-0 or 10-0. So, yeah, I think from a structural point of view, that makes very little sense. But anyway, this is where we are. The final also, it fits a couple of other trends you can see in the tournament. So a pair of African coaches, Pape Thiaw of Senegal and Wally Bougragui of Morocco. It's only the second time this century we've had 2 local coaches in the final. We had Jamal Belmadi against Aliou Cissé in 2019 in that Algeria against Senegal final in Cairo. It's the first time we've had 4 African coaches in the last 4 since 1965. So this, I think, is a hugely positive move that we've been saying for years that one of the areas where African football lags behind is its production of coaches. Now, whether Africa itself is producing those coaches, I think is a slightly different question. That we saw with, for instance, Belmadi against Cissé, they'd grown up very close to each other in Paris. They were produced by a European system. Not quite the same here, but obviously both Pape Thiaw and Regragui, huge experience in Europe, and they clearly have used that. They've also both coached in their own countries. But it is taking that European education and then applying it in Africa. And I guess that's just the way it is. The nature of football is that all the wealth is in Europe, and therefore talent will gravitate there, whether those players or coaches are born in Europe or whether they're born in Africa and subsequently move there. I think you see that in the players as well. There's roughly a third of players in this Cup of Nations were born in Europe. You look at the 2 squads for the final, 28-man squads. 14 of the Morocco side were not born in Morocco. 13 of the Senegal side were not born in Senegal. Now, that's not to in any way say those players are not committed to their countries. It's not to probe too deeply into the complexities of national identity in a globalised world. but it is revealing as to where players tend to get their footballing education. Now, Morocco, I think, have taken steps to try to improve that, quite significant steps. You have the Mohammed VI Academy, was opened just outside Rabat in 2009. There's now, I think it's 4 other branches around the country. And that clearly is working. 4 players in their World Cup squad who, of course, got to the semi-final, first African team ever to get to the semi-final. 4 of them came through that academy. And they won the Under-20 World Cup last year with a squad of whom the majority came through that academy. So that is, I think, a good example of the investment Morocco have made in football. And they've pumped in a huge amount of money. The stadiums are excellent. The general infrastructure, the trains, hotels, all of that has been extremely good. And you can see that they're moving towards the World Cup. It's not ready yet, but it's pretty close. The Al Borak, the TGV line from Rabat going up to Tangier. I mean that's excellent. A 75-minute journey for something that previously was taking 3 to 4 hours. They're going to extend that south to Casablanca. I don't think they'll have time to get down to Marrakesh, but Marrakesh to Casablanca is only another 2.5, 3 hours on the conventional train. And the conventional trains are pretty good. I think the problem city in terms of that World Cup bid is Agadir. It's a bit cut off. It's not on the train network, so I'm not quite sure what they can do with that. But Fez as well is linked into that line at Kenitra. So I think in terms of getting fans, journalists around the country, I think the train network isn't far off for that World Cup bid. In terms of specifics, in terms of the final, I think we'll see Morocco sitting deep. Senegal have had to play against 2 teams who played like that in both the quarterfinal and the semi-final. They've done it very well without overcommitting. I think there's been some frustration, particularly that Mali game in the quarterfinal, that they weren't a little bit more aggressive. They didn't try to finish the game off earlier when they were playing against 10 men. But Sadio Mane, I thought was very, very interesting after the semi-final, saying how they were very aware of the threat that Egypt presented on the break and how they were determined not to give the ball away cheaply. And if that meant playing in quite a patient way and just assuming at some point a chance would fall for them, then that was the way it was. And that was how they played very successfully in both those games. And they do have forwards like Iliman Ndiaye, like Nicholas Jackson, like Mane himself, who are very, very capable of seizing on those half chances. Morocco, I think we've seen defensively clearly very, very good. Bono is clearly an excellent keeper when it comes to penalty shootouts. So I think if Senegal are to win it, they probably need to win it before the penalty shootout. Edouard Mendy, I'm not sure, is Bono's equal in that regard. But I think a lot depends on how Brahim Diaz and Ezadza, who've carried the counter-attacking threat down the flanks, Brahim Diaz has weighed in with 5 goals as well. A lot depends on how involved they are and how Crepin Diatta and El Hadj Malik Diouf, how they're able to counter them. And those 2 fullbacks of Senegal, I think, have been 2 of these real unsung heroes for them. That Diouf has only played 3 games, but he really has now taken over from Jacobs in that role. Senegal will be out. We will be without Kalidou Koulibaly, their captain and centre-back, and also Habib Diarra, the midfielder. Both suspended. I know. Well, Koulibaly is probably injured as well. But he got the yellow card and then had to go off with an injury in that semi-final. I'm not sure quite how big a loss that is. I mean, Papchor was saying, obviously, I prefer to play with my captain, and I'm sure that's true. But Mamadou Sarr, 20-year-old, he's at Strasbourg on loan from Chelsea. I thought he was very impressive when he came on. Koulibaly's not the player he was, and there's Napoli pomp. He's lost a bit of pace since then. So it does weaken them. The experience that they lose, I think, is key. And then in midfield, Habib Diarra is clearly an excellent player. I'm just not sure that balance with him and Idrissa Gueye and Pape Gueye, I'm not sure that balance is necessarily right. And against Egypt in the second half, after Lamine Camara had come on at half-time for Habib Diarra, I thought they looked a better side. They looked more progressive. Maybe that was Egypt timing. It's difficult to tell. But they had more creative threat with him. And, of course, it was his shot, which was half-blocked and fell for Sadio Mane to score. So I think this final, obviously going to be a hugely passionate crowd. We've seen that throughout the tournament. That stadium has been a sea of red in those games. So Morocco, I think, are favourites. But they're not overwhelming favourites. And Senegal, this is their 3rd final in the last 4 competitions. They're very good. It's the second generation on that side, really. It's not the same players as it was in 2019. But they have the experience. They are used to dealing with this kind of situation. But I think Morocco probably are just about favourites. But, of course, they do have the pressure that they haven't won this tournament for 50 years. And that weight, plus the huge expenditure on infrastructure, that has created the pressure and expectation. And at times, they have struggled to deal with that. But they've lost 4 of the last 49 games under Wahid Regragui. And they have proved their worth. So Morocco, slight favourites for me, but I think it should be maybe not a high-scoring final, but certainly an intriguing one. We'll see you after that. Thanks for listening.